A festive road trip. In December 1975, the Miller family set off on a road trip from New York to Vermont to spend Christmas. Eve in a cozy rental cabin deep in the woods. Sarah and Jack, along with their teenage daughter Emily, were eager for a holiday away from the bustling city. The snow-covered roads gleamed under the pale light of the moon, and the sound of Christmas carols played softly on the radio. As the family drove deeper into the countryside, Emily noticed something strange outside. "Look at that man," she exclaimed, pointing at a figure standing by the edge of the forest. He was dressed in tattered clothes, his head bowed, and his hand raised as if waving. Jack slowed the car, but as the headlights fell on the man, he vanished into the shadows. "That's creepy," Emily whispered. Sarah brushed it off as a trick of the light. They continued driving, but the festive spirit was dampened by an uneasy silence in the car. The cabin in the woods. When they finally reached the cabin, the air was biting cold, and the wind howled through the surrounding trees. The cabin itself looked charming, but eerily isolated. Inside, it was warm and welcoming, with a roaring fireplace and holiday decorations set up by the rental company. However, Emily couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. As the family settled in, they heard the faint sound of sleigh bells in the distance. Sarah smiled. Maybe a neighbor is spreading some Christmas cheer. But Jack frowned. "There's no one for miles around," he said. Later that evening, while Jack was outside chopping wood, Sarah and Emily decorated the Christmas tree. Suddenly, Emily gasped. "Mom, look," she said, pointing to the window. A pale face with hollow eyes stared back at them. But when Sarah ran to the window, no one was there. Jack returned moments later, swearing he heard someone walking around the cabin. "It's probably just animals," he said, trying to calm them. But the unease was growing. Midnight visitor. As the clock struck midnight, the family gathered in the living room to open one gift each, a holiday tradition. The room was warm, and for a brief moment, they began to relax. But just as Emily reached for a gift, a loud, deliberate knock echoed through the cabin. Jack opened the door cautiously, but no one was there. The snow outside was untouched, with no footprints leading to or from the cabin. "This isn't funny," he muttered, locking the door tightly. Then, the knocking came again, this time from the window behind them. The family froze. Emily whimpered, "We're not alone." Jack grabbed a fire poker and moved toward the window, but just like before, no one was there. Suddenly, the fireplace roared violently, and the flames turned an unnatural shade of blue. Shadows danced along the walls, forming shapes that looked like people. Sarah screamed as the sound of sleigh bells grew louder and louder, accompanied by faint whispers. A terrifying revelation. The whispers turned into voices, clear and chilling. "Leave this place," they said in unison. The family grabbed their coats and ran out into the snow, leaving everything behind. As they fled to their car, Emily turned back and let out a blood-curdling scream. The figure from earlier stood in the cabin's doorway, watching them. His hollow eyes locked onto Emily, and his hand slowly lifted in the mocking wave. They piled into the car and sped away, the figure growing smaller in the rearview mirror. But as they reached the main road, they were stopped by a local sheriff. Breathless and shaking, Jack explained what had happened. The sheriff's face turned pale. "You stayed at the old Holloway cabin?" he asked. When Jack nodded, the sheriff grimly explained, "That cabin burned down in 1942. On Christmas Eve, a family died in the fire, and it's said their spirits never left. People who stay there, they don't always make it out." The warning: the Millers never celebrated Christmas the same way again. Rumors of the cursed cabin persisted, and locals avoided the area at all costs. Years later, Emily found an old photo in the library archive while researching the legend. In it, The Holloway family stood proudly in front of their cabin, their faces lit with joy, but standing in the background, just barely visible, was the same figure with hollow eyes, a warning that the cabin was never truly empty. The Millers learned the hard way that some Christmas traditions are better left forgotten. It was the winter of 1984, and Allison Ward, a journalist for a small Boston newspaper, received an unusual letter. The letter came from an elderly man named Henry Whitaker, who claimed to have witnessed something unspeakable on Christmas Eve decades ago in a tiny Massachusetts village called Hollow Creek. He invited her to hear his story, promising it was one she would never forget. Intrigued and eager to escape the city for a few days, Allison packed her bag and drove to Hollow Creek. As she approached the village, the snow-laden streets were quiet, the houses adorned with faded wreaths and cracked ornaments. It seemed as though the place had been forgotten by time. She arrived at Henry's home, a decrepit Victorian house on the edge of the woods. Henry greeted her with a frail smile, his face pale and his hands trembling. "Thank you for coming," he whispered. "You're brave to be here on Christmas Eve." As they sat by the fireplace, Henry began his story. In 1947, he said, Hollow Creek was a lively town. Every Christmas Eve, the townsfolk would gather in the square to sing carols by the light of lanterns. It was a tradition that brought joy to everyone. But that year, something changed. Henry explained that during the caroling, a stranger had appeared, a tall man dressed in a black coat and wide-brimmed hat. His face was hidden in shadow, but his presence cast a chill over the crowd. He stood at the edge of the square, watching silently. Henry continued. When someone invited him to join, he simply shook his head and walked away into the woods. That night, the Carollas returned to their homes, but not everyone made it back. A young couple and their child were found the next morning in the woods, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Their bodies were untouched, with no signs of violence. The only clue was a trail of footprints leading from the square to their home and then back into the forest, where they vanished. The townsfolk were horrified, but dismissed it as a tragic accident. Yet, the following Christmas Eve, more people vanished. It became clear that something was haunting Hollow Creek. Henry leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They say the man in black isn't human. He comes every Christmas Eve, drawn by the sound of carols. Those who sing are marked. He follows them home, and they're never seen again." Allison frowned. "Why does no one leave the village, then?" she asked. "Some tried," Henry said, "but they never made it far. Their cars broke down, or they were found dead on the outskirts of town. The rest of us, we learned to stay silent on Christmas Eve. No singing, no music, only silence." As midnight approached, Henry urged Allison to leave the house. "The less you see, the better," he said. But Allison was skeptical. She decided to stay and see for herself whether the legend was real. Walking through the deserted streets, she noticed how eerily quiet the village was. Not a single light shone in the windows, and the snow seemed to absorb all sound. She reached the town square, where an old lamppost cast a faint glow. Out of curiosity, she hummed a few bars of Silent Night. Her voice carried softly through the cold air. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, she heard a faint crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow. Allison's breath caught. Turning, she saw a figure at the edge of the square. He was tall and dressed in black, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. He stood perfectly still, but she felt his gaze pierce through her. Panicking, she ran back to Henry's house, slamming the door behind her. Henry was waiting, his face ashen. "What did you do?" he whispered. I just hummed," she stammered. Henry's expression turned grave. "He heard you." That night, Allison couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made her heart race. Around 3 a.m., she heard the sound of footsteps on the porch. Peeking through the curtains, she saw the man in black standing by the gate, motionless. She called the police, but the line crackled with static. The figure remained there for hours, never moving, until dawn broke. When Allison finally worked up the courage to look again, he was gone, but in the snow were footprints leading to her window. Henry insisted she leave the village immediately. "He'll follow you," he warned. "He always does." Allison drove away from Hollow Creek as fast as she could. She tried to convince herself it was all a trick, a small town legend meant to scare outsiders. But even as she returned to the bustling streets of Boston, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. That Christmas night, as she worked on her article, she heard faint caroling outside her apartment window. Peering out, she saw a small group of singers on the sidewalk. Among them was a tall figure in a black coat and hat, his face still hidden in shadow. The next morning, Allison's neighbors found her apartment door open and her belongings untouched. Allison Ward had vanished, leaving behind only a half-written article titled "The Silent Carol." To this day, locals in Hollow Creek warn visitors to stay silent on Christmas Eve, but in the distance, some still claim to hear faint singing and the soft crunch of footsteps in the snow. On Christmas Eve in 1978, a freak snowstorm trapped the residents of the small, remote town of Winter Hollow in their homes. Among them was 29-year-old Claire Hudson, a school teacher spending her first holiday alone after her parents passed away. Claire was settling in with a glass of wine and an old radio playing Christmas carols when the music cut off abruptly. In its place was a monotone male voice. "Attention, citizens of Winter Hollow. Tonight, the Red Star rises. Keep your lights off. Stay inside. Do not respond to any knocks at your door." The message repeated once before the radio fell silent. Claire frowned. "What kind of sick joke is this?" she muttered, turning the dial, but all the stations were dead. She looked outside, expecting to see festive lights in her neighbors' windows, but every house was dark, their Christmas decorations unlit. Above, the snowstorm had cleared, revealing a crimson star glowing unnaturally bright in the sky. As the hours passed, Claire grew restless. The house felt too quiet, the silence pressing against her like a physical weight. At 11:15 p.m., she heard the first knock. It was soft and deliberate, coming from the front door. Claire froze, the words from the BROADCAST echoing in her mind. "Do not respond to any knocks at your door." Peeking through the peephole, she saw nothing but swirling snow, yet the knocking continued, steady and patient. She backed away, her heart pounding. Moments later, her phone rang, startling her. She picked it up, relieved to hear her neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, on the other end. "Claire," the old woman whispered, her voice trembling. "They're here. Don't open your door. Don't even look at them." "Who's there?" Claire asked, but the line went dead. Claire tried to distract herself by turning on the TV, but the screen flickered with static. She glanced out the window and saw movement in the snow. At first, it looked like people walking aimlessly, but then she noticed the way they moved jerky, unnatural, as if they were marionettes controlled by invisible strings. The figures stopped suddenly and turned in unison to face her house. Though their faces were hidden in shadow, Claire felt their gaze piercing through the walls. One of them raised an arm and pointed directly at her window. She stumbled back, pulling the curtains closed. The knocking resumed, louder this time, as if several hands were pounding on the door. At midnight, the red star in the sky grew brighter, casting an eerie glow over the entire town. Claire's house began to fill with the same crimson light. Despite her curtains being drawn, she could hear whispers now, faint and unintelligible, seeping through the walls like water. Desperate, she tried calling for help, but her phone emitted only static. She turned on every light in the house, hoping it would keep the figures at bay. But then she remembered the warning, "Keep your lights off." The whispers turned into a single voice, deep and resonant, speaking directly into her mind. Claire Hudson opened the door. She screamed, covering her ears, but the voice grew louder. "Open the door, Claire. Let us in." The knocking stopped suddenly, replaced by a chilling silence. Claire's breath fogged in the freezing air as the temperature in the house plummeted. She heard the faint creak of footsteps inside, coming from the upstairs hallway. Gripping a fireplace poker, she crept up the stairs. At the end of the hallway, her bedroom door was ajar, and the crimson light spilled out. She pushed the door open to find a man standing in the middle of the room, his back to her. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his hair white as snow. Slowly, he turned to face her, revealing hollow eyes that glowed with the same red light as the star outside. His mouth moved, but the words she heard were not spoken. They were in her mind. "We've been waiting for you." Behind him, the walls of her bedroom began to dissolve, revealing a vast, desolate landscape under the red star. Figures like those she had seen outside were gathering in the distance, their heads tilted unnaturally, as if listening for something. The man extended a hand toward Claire. "You called to us," he said, "with your curiosity, with your fear." Claire tried to back away, but her feet wouldn't move. The whispers were deafening now, filling the room with an otherworldly hum. The figures outside were closer, their faces becoming clearer twisted, featureless masks of flesh. Suddenly, the red light faded, replaced by blinding darkness. When Claire woke, it was morning. The storm had passed, and the red star was gone. But Winter Hollow was eerily quiet. As Claire walked through the town, she found no signs of life. Houses were abandoned, doors left wide open, meals half-eaten on tables. It was as if the entire town had vanished overnight. In the snow, she found footprints leading to each house and then back into the woods, where they disappeared. Returning home, she discovered something chilling. A photograph on her dining table that hadn't been there before. It showed the man with the glowing eyes standing among the missing townsfolk, all staring at the camera with blank expressions. The last thing she noticed was the date scrawled at the bottom of the photo, December 25th, 1978. Claire left Winter Hollow that day and never returned. But every Christmas Eve, she wakes to find the crimson glow outside her window and hears the faint, patient sound of knocking at her door.